The vote had already been decided before the humans walked into the room. Everyone in the Galactic Concord Assembly knew it. The clerks knew it. The translators knew it. Even the maintenance worker polishing the floor tiles near the East Corridor knew it, because he had overheard 3 Tharan aides laughing about it in the hallway an hour before the session began. The humans did not know it yet. Or maybe they did, and they came anyway, because that was the kind of species they were. Ambassador Ren Holt entered the chamber with 4 people behind him. No guards, no ceremonial banners, just 4 people carrying document cases and looking like they had work to do. He was not a large man. He did not wear medals or colored sashes the way the Tharan delegates did. He wore a plain dark jacket and had the kind of face that looked like it had spent a long time listening to difficult things without reacting. He took his seat at the long table. Around him sat representatives from 31 species. The Tharan bloc occupied the raised central seats, as they always did. Voss, the senior Tharan delegate, was already watching Holt with the particular expression of someone who has prepared a joke and is waiting for the right moment to tell it. Director Yara Solden sat to Holt's right. She was the head of Humanity's Deep Space Resource Division, and she had spent 3 years on this negotiation. She placed her documents on the table with the careful precision of someone who had organized and reorganized them so many times that the action was now automatic. The matter before the assembly was simple, in the way that unfair things are often described as simple. Humanity had found the outer belt 11 years ago. Their survey ships had mapped it. Their engineers had cataloged its mineral content. Their people had died in 3 separate accidents during the early exploration phase, when the gravitational currents in that region were still not well understood. They had done all of this without asking anyone for help, because no one had offered any. Now the outer belt was known to hold more usable rare element deposits than any region charted in the past century, and suddenly everyone had opinions about who it belonged to. The Tharan bloc had spent 3 years proposing alternative frameworks, joint ownership structures, and shared governance models, all of which, when you read them carefully, meant that humanity would do the extraction work while the bloc collected the majority of the yield. Each time Holt's team rejected a proposal, a new one appeared within weeks, slightly reworded but structurally identical. Holt had been patient. His team had been patient. They had filed counter-proposals, attended arbitration sessions, and submitted documentation that filled more storage space than most species used for their entire diplomatic archives. Today, he was presenting the final human draft. He stood. He did not use theatrical language. He laid out the terms in plain words, recognized human sovereignty over the discovered sectors, a fair revenue-sharing model for jointly operated zones, and a clear boundary map that had already been reviewed and approved by 14 neutral species. It took him 9 minutes. When he sat down, Voss leaned toward his speaking column and smiled. He called the human proposal ambitious for a species so new to galactic cooperation. He said the boundary maps reflected a charming but unrealistic attachment to the concept of discovery rights. He said, with the particular cruelty of someone who knows the room is with them, that humanity's contributions to the Outer Belt Survey were noted, appreciated, and not especially relevant to questions of long-term governance. Laughter moved through parts of the chamber, not all of it, but enough. Holt did not change his expression. He looked at the table in front of him for a moment. Then he looked at Solden. She gave one small nod. It was barely visible. Holt closed his document folder. He clicked his translation pin off, then on again, to make sure what he said next went out clearly in all 31 registered languages of the chamber. The human delegation thanks the Assembly for 3 years of engagement, he said. Effective at the close of this session, humanity is withdrawing from all active negotiations under conquered jurisdiction. This includes the Outer Belt Treaty talks, the Selen Transit Corridor Agreement, the Joint Medical Exchange Program, the Gorvek Border Monitoring Compact, and the 17 pending trade framework discussions. We will be in contact when circumstances change. He stood, Solden and the 4 others stood with him. For a moment, nobody in the chamber moved. Voss recovered first. He made a sound that was the Tharan equivalent of a laugh and said something about bluffs being a human cultural tradition. Nobody else laughed. Holt did not respond. He picked up his folder. He walked toward the exit at a pace that was neither fast nor slow, the way a person walks when they have already made a decision and have nothing left to prove. Near the back of the chamber, in the observer seats reserved for junior staff, a young Tharan aide named Pell watched the human delegation reach the door. He had been assigned to this posting 6 months ago, and had spent most of that time being told that humans were a minor species with outsized opinions of themselves. He watched the door close. He turned to the senior aide beside him and said quietly, "Did they just leave?" The senior aide did not answer. At the main table, Voss was already moving on to the next agenda item, but for just a moment before he spoke, his eyes went to the door. It stayed closed. The first thing people noticed was the buoys. There were thousands of them spread across 14 border zones, small relay stations, each about the size of a ground vehicle, each quietly doing 3 things at once. They tracked gravitational shifts. They flagged incoming debris. They kept communication lines open between conquered relay towers that were too far apart to talk to each other on their own. Nobody had put them there officially. They had just appeared over the course of about 8 years, installed by human survey and trade vessels that apparently could not pass through a region without improving it. 32 days after the walkout, the buoys stopped sending updates. Their maintenance licenses had quietly lapsed. No human technician came to renew them. Nobody noticed for another 2 weeks because the data they provided had been feeding into conquered systems so smoothly for so long that it looked like background information rather than something a specific species was generating. When a Gorvek navigation officer finally traced the missing data back to its source and realized what had happened, she filed a report. The report was marked low priority because the person who received it assumed someone else was already dealing with it. 3 months after the walkout, Concord's Secretary Dara Hin called an emergency session. She was not a dramatic person. She had run the Assembly's administrative structure for 11 years and was known for speaking in short, clear sentences and expecting people to listen the first time. When she said the word emergency, delegates paid attention. She stood at the head of the table and read from a list. The human early warning network across the border zones was dark. The anti-piracy escort routes that human traders had been running in the Selen corridor, informally, as a side arrangement attached to their trade access, had stopped. A disease outbreak on 2 Gorvek colony stations had been contained for the past 2 years by a vaccine matrix that, it turned out, was distributed and updated by a human medical logistics company, operating under a quiet agreement nobody in the current Concord administration had known to look for. That company had suspended external shipments. A Selen port director had contacted the Assembly to report that 3 human merchants who had been docking at his station for years, and who had, apparently, been resolving minor trade disputes between local operators as an informal side activity, had not returned since the walkout. Tensions at the station were building without them. Hin put the list down. "I want to be precise about what I am describing," she said. "I am not describing hostile action by humanity. I am describing the absence of actions that humanity was taking voluntarily, without compensation, which we had integrated into our operations without formally recognizing or recording them." The chamber was quiet. Voss said that humanity was being petty. He said this loudly and with the confidence of someone who needed to believe what he was saying. Admiral Sura of the Gorvek fleet sat 3 seats down from him and did not speak for a long time. She was looking at a map on her personal display, a navigation chart of the outer corridor, with a thick red line marking a new piracy report that had come in that morning. The corridor on the map had been green for 4 years. Human vessels had kept it green. Sura finally looked up and said, in a quiet voice that still carried, "Voss, stop talking." There was a very uncomfortable silence. Hin attempted to move the session toward solutions. She suggested that the assembly formally contact Ambassador Holt to open a channel. The idea received broad support. A message was composed and sent. The reply came back within the hour. It was polite. It used correct formal language. It said, "The human delegation is not currently engaged in external diplomatic relations under conquered jurisdiction. We appreciate your communication and wish the assembly well." Voss called it manipulation. He called it childish. He spent a significant portion of the afternoon calling it various things. Sura, meanwhile, had pulled up a second map alongside the first. This one covered the full range of former human activity across conquered space. Every patrol route, every relay installation, every informal service arrangement that her staff had been able to document in the past 3 months. It was considerably larger than she had expected. There were marks on it that covered regions she had not even known humans operated in. She thought about a principle her navigation instructor had told her years ago. You do not understand a system by watching it work. You understand it when something stops and you see everything downstream that depended on it. She saved the map to her personal files and closed the display before anyone could see it. The session ended without resolution. That night in her office, she received the report she had been halfway expecting. A Gorvek supply convoy in the outer corridor, 3 vessels, had been hit by raiders. No casualties, but the cargo was gone and 1 ship had taken engine damage. It was the 3rd incident in that corridor in 6 weeks. She looked at the map again. The space where human patrol ships used to be was not empty on the map. It just had nothing in it that was doing what they had done. She put the map away and started drafting a different kind of request, not to the assembly and not to Voss. Directly to the outer belt coordinates where, according to a single intelligence report that had crossed her desk 2 days ago, a large number of human ships had quietly repositioned after the walkout. She did not know if anyone would answer. She sent it anyway. Pell had not slept well in 6 weeks. He had been promoted, if it could be called that, to lead the Human Absence Assessment, a formal audit requested by Concord's Secretary Hin after the emergency session. The task sounded manageable when it was assigned to him. Document what services humanity had provided. Estimate the gap. Recommend alternatives. He was now on his 4th revision of the introduction, because every time he thought he had understood the full scope of the problem, he found something else. He started as instructed with the obvious items: the relay buoys, the escort routes, the vaccine matrix. He listed them carefully and began working on cost estimates for replacement. Then a data clerk brought him a secondary file flagged items that had come up during the audit but did not fit the main categories. Pell opened it expecting a few footnotes. It had 214 entries. He worked through them over 3 days, cross-checking each one against Concord infrastructure records. What he found was not a list of services. It was a picture of a species that had been, for over a decade, quietly filling in every gap it walked past. The gravitational hazard warnings were one example. Human deep survey teams filed detailed reports about unstable regions whenever they mapped new territory. Those reports went into a shared database that 3 species, the Mulvan, the Dross, and 1 branch of the Selen colonial fleet, had integrated into their navigation systems. The Mulvan had rerouted 4 colony ships in the past 2 years based on human hazard data. None of those ships knew the data was human-sourced. None of the Mulvan officials Pell contacted had known either. The educational archive was another. Humanity maintained a translated science and engineering database, openly accessible, that had been referenced in over 9,000 conquered academic and technical documents. It was not advertised. It had no official name. It had simply existed, kept updated by a human university consortium, because someone had decided it was useful to have. There was a water filtration system design, open source, freely available, that was now running on 41 stations across 6 species, most of which had adopted it through informal engineering channels without knowing who had written it. There was a quiet arrangement between a human freight company and a Selen orbital station, where the humans stored emergency food supplies for the station at no cost, in exchange for docking priority. The station manager who testified about it said she had assumed this was normal. She had never thought about what would happen if the arrangement ended. The storage was now empty. Pell wrote all of it down. He interviewed 37 people from 11 species. Most of them said some version of the same thing. They had not thought about where the service came from because it had always been there. A Dross engineer said it plainly. "We do not think about air until we cannot breathe it." Pell included that quote in the report. He was not sure it was appropriate, but he could not think of anything more accurate. The section that took him the longest to write was the final one. He called it behavioral pattern because he did not know what else to call it. It described something he had noticed across all 214 entries. Humanity had not been invited to do any of these things. There were no contracts, no formal agreements, no letters of recognition. They had simply encountered a problem, a dark relay corridor, a species without vaccine coverage, a station without backup food, and addressed it, often without telling anyone, often at their own cost. In one case, a human engineering team had spent 8 months redesigning a pressure regulation system for a Gorvik underwater habitat after the original design was found to be faulty. They had done this after noticing the flaw in a public technical document. They had contacted the Habitat Administration, offered their help, been ignored, done the work anyway, and filed the corrected design to the public record. The Habitat had adopted the new design without knowing who wrote it. Pell sat with that entry for a long time. He wrote, "Humanity does not appear to perform these actions in exchange for recognition or leverage. The consistent pattern across all documented cases is action taken because the problem was present and they were capable of addressing it. This is not a diplomatic strategy. It appears to be a cultural characteristic." He submitted the report to Secretary Hin. Then, because he was not sure the right people would read it, he forwarded a copy to Voss. He received a reply 40 minutes later. It said, "Send me another copy, that one tore." He stared at that message for a moment. Then he sent another copy without comment. What he did not include in his official report, because it was not yet confirmed, was something he had found while cross-referencing ship registry data in the outer belt. A pattern of vessel movements, logged 6 weeks after the walkout. Large human ships, freight haulers, a few medical vessels, 2 construction platforms, all moving to the same region, all registered to different companies, different purposes, but all arriving at the same coordinates within a 10-day window. They were not doing anything aggressive. They were not blocking any lanes or challenging any ships. They were sitting in deep space past the contested belt, running standard operations. A few had begun docking with each other. Building something. He marked the file and saved it in a separate folder. He would need to report it eventually. But tonight, he closed his terminal, turned off his lamp, and sat in the dark for a while, thinking about what it meant that humanity had stopped filling the gaps and was now filling different ones, somewhere else for someone else. The first delegation to try was the Selen. They sent an envoy to the outer belt coordinates with a proposal from their trade ministry. It offered humanity preferential docking rights at 4 Selen stations and a modest cut of the belt's projected mineral yield. The envoy's ship was met at the perimeter by a small human communications platform that asked politely for the purpose of his visit. He explained. There was a pause. The platform told him, equally politely, that Director Solden was not available for unscheduled meetings, and that he was welcome to submit his proposal through formal channels for review. He waited 2 days in his ship before going home. The Gorvek sent a full minister with an appointment request filed 2 weeks in advance. They received a response, an automated message noting that humanity was not currently seeking agreements under Concord-mediated frameworks, but that independent proposals would be considered in due course. In due course was not a phrase the Gorvek minister had ever been told before. He found it deeply uncomfortable. Voss did not send a delegation, he sent a letter. It had taken him 3 weeks to write, and it showed. It was 3 pages long. It acknowledged that the session had been less productive than hoped. It noted that humanity's contributions to Concord infrastructure were now more fully understood and appreciated. It said that the Tharan bloc was prepared to revisit the structure of previous proposals with greater attention to mutual benefit. Technically, it was an apology, in the way that a bucket with holes in it is technically a bucket. Holt did not respond personally. His office sent a brief acknowledgement that the letter had been received. Voss read the acknowledgement 4 times, looking for hidden meaning. There was none. It simply said the letter had been received. He threw it across the room. Then he told his aide to file it carefully because he might need it later. It was Secretary Hin who finally made real contact. She did not send a message first. She simply filed a request for a personal visit, stated her name and position, gave 3 possible dates, and asked which was convenient. She received a reply within a day. One of the dates was confirmed. A set of coordinates was attached. The human outer belt station was not what she had expected. She had expected a temporary outpost, something that looked like it was waiting to be moved, the way facilities look when the people inside them are still deciding where they want to be. What she found instead was a station that had clearly been built for permanence. The corridors were wide and well lit. There were sections that looked like long-term residential space. There was a garden, an actual room filled with growing things, which required water and atmosphere maintenance, and was not the kind of thing you installed if you planned to leave in 6 months. Director Solden met her at the docking bay. She shook Hin's hand in the human manner and led her to a meeting room with a window that looked out at the belt. They talked for 4 hours. Solden was not hostile. She was not triumphant. She spoke the way someone speaks when they have been through something difficult and have arrived at a kind of clarity on the other side of it. She said that humanity held no anger toward the conquered or any specific species. She said that anger had not been the reason for the walkout. We left, she said, because we had been at that table for 3 years, and the message we kept receiving was that we were there to serve the process, not to be part of it. And we had been accepting that message for much longer than 3 years, since before the outer belt, probably since we first arrived. Hin said that was not the intention. Solden said she understood that. Intentions were not the same as outcomes. Then she took Hin to a different room and showed her what humanity had been doing for the past 6 months. The new network had a name now, the Outer Compact. It had 6 member species, the 3 small ones who had left the Tharan Trade Pact, plus 3 others that Hin had not known were in talks. It had its own relay infrastructure, already more extensive than the old Concord network in the outer regions. It had a medical exchange program with a formal structure and signed agreements. It had a navigation database that was, in Hin's private assessment, better than the Concord's. It was not built out of spite. That was what struck her most. It was built the same way everything humanity built was built, because there was a need and they had the capacity to fill it. We are not waiting, Solden said. That is what I want you to understand. We are not standing outside the door hoping someone will open it. We opened our own door. Hin returned to the conquered station and stood before the full assembly. She spoke one sentence. "They are not waiting for you to invite them back. They are building something that does not need you." The room was quiet in the way rooms are quiet when people are doing rapid, uncomfortable arithmetic. 3 days later, the Mulvin, the Dross, and the Atari submitted formal withdrawal notices from the Tharan Trade Pact. The notices were filed with careful procedural language, but everyone understood what they meant. They meant humanity had already found a better table. And they had been invited to sit at it. Numbers are clean. That is the problem with them. You can write down 11,000 and it looks like a figure in a report. It does not look like what it actually is. 11,000 people on a colony planet who needed a vaccine update that did not arrive because the network delivering it was operated by a human medical company that had suspended external shipments 8 months ago. The outbreak on Selen's fourth colony planet lasted 6 weeks. The conquered response was slow not because anyone was careless, but because the replacement network was not as good. It had been built in a hurry by 3 species using systems that did not talk to each other well. The humans who had designed the original had spent years on it. Nobody else had that knowledge or that time. 11,000 people. Pell read the number in the situation report and set the document down and did not pick it up again for a while. He had 3 other reports on his desk. The first was from the Dorothy system. A colony transport carrying 800 people had been rerouted around a gravitational anomaly, but the advisory had come late because the human survey team that would normally have flagged that anomaly was no longer filing to the conquered database. The ship's reroute pushed it outside its fuel margin. 200 passengers were evacuated to a secondary vessel during a 4-day emergency stop. No one died. But the colony transport would not reach its destination for another 3 months. The second report was from the outer corridor. Admiral Sura's forces had engaged raiders for the 3rd time in 2 months. 3 Gorvek escort ships damaged, 1 beyond repair. Her assessment at the bottom was 4 words: "We cannot keep this up." The third report was about the Tharan block. 2 smaller aligned species had begun asking in internal communications whether the handling of the human situation had been wise. One had quietly sent a trade inquiry to a human commercial office in the outer belt and received a prompt, courteous reply. Voss was aware of all of this. He had been made aware by 3 different aides in the same morning and had not left his office since. Pell knocked and entered without waiting. Voss looked worse than Pell had ever seen him. Not broken, Voss was not the kind of person who broke easily, but he looked like a person who had been running a calculation for a long time and had finally arrived at an answer he did not want. Pell set the 4th document on Voss's desk. He had been working on it for 2 weeks. He had started it the night he read the Selen outbreak number, when he had decided that waiting for someone else to fix this was not something he was willing to keep doing. It was a treaty proposal. Not like the old ones. He had not started from the old frameworks. He had started from Pell's audit, his own report, and from a simple question. If you had to write an agreement that a person with dignity would actually sign, what would it say? It said a great deal. It took 31 pages. It acknowledged human discovery rights. It formalized the outer belt boundaries as humanity had proposed. It established a compensation structure for infrastructure services, the relays, the medical networks, the navigational databases, with a formal recognition clause that named each service and the species who provided it. It included a provision for the outer compact to be recognized as a parallel body within the conquered structure, not a subordinate one. Voss read the first page, then the second he read slowly. "They'll want changes," he said. 3 clauses, Pell said. "Probably I'd expect 3. Voss kept reading. At some point he stopped and looked out the window for a while. Then he looked back at the document. "I was wrong," he said, not loudly, not dramatically, like a person stating something factual that had taken too long to become clear. Pell said nothing. I knew they were useful, Voss said. I didn't think they were. I didn't understand what it looked like from where they were standing. 11,000 people, Pell said. Voss nodded slowly. He picked up the document again. In the outer belt, at almost the same hour, Ambassador Holt stood in front of a small assembly of outer compact representatives. Not a speech, just a conversation around a working table, and said something that was later shared across the compact's internal network. He said, "We did not leave to cause harm. We left because staying was causing harm to us, and we had run out of reasons to accept that. What we are building now is what we wanted to build before, a structure where every species at the table is there because they are valued, not because they are useful. When we return to the larger table, if we return, it will be as that, not as background infrastructure, as partners." He paused. Then he said, "Now, what does the Dross delegation need for the water system on their second station?" The conversation moved on. Voss set the proposal on his desk and said one thing to Pell. "Send it to Holt." The room had been rearranged. Nobody announced this. Nobody sent a memo, but when the delegations arrived, the seating was different. The Tharan block's raised central platform, a fixture of the chamber for 40 years, had been removed. Every seat was at the same level. Hin had authorized the change 3 days earlier. When her aide asked whether to notify the Tharan delegation in advance, she said no. The humans arrived as a group of 11. The additional 6 were representatives from the outer compact, 2 Mulvan, 1 Dross, an Atari trade minister, and 2 others. They sat beside the human delegates without ceremony, as people sit beside colleagues. Voss was already at the table when they entered. He had arrived early. He watched them take their seats and said nothing designed to establish status. He sat with his hands folded and waited. Pell sat beside him with a printed copy of the proposal. Hin opened the session without ceremony and asked Pell to present. He read all 31 pages aloud. It took 40 minutes. The chamber was quiet in the way rooms are quiet when people are actually listening. When he finished, Holt looked at Solden. She passed him a handwritten sheet. 3 clauses, Holt said. Pell almost smiled. The first clause was the recognition language in the infrastructure section. Holt's team wanted it made permanent and binding, not subject to periodic review. The Concord had written it with a 5-year reassessment window. This was a reasonable concern. They negotiated it to a 12-year baseline with reassessment only by mutual agreement. It took 20 minutes. The second clause was the outer compact's formal status. Pell had written it as a parallel body, which was accurate, but Holt said the language still implied the Concord was the parent structure. He wanted them recognized as a co-equal independent body that had chosen to coordinate with the Concord, not one that existed within it. The distinction was small in practice and significant in principle. Hin ruled on this one herself. She said Holt was correct and the language should reflect the reality, which was that the compact existed independently of the Concord's recognition, and the Concord should be honest about that. Some delegates looked uncomfortable. Hin ignored them. The third clause concerned the outer belt boundary maps. Holt's team wanted one small sector added to the human sovereignty zone, a region that Pell's original draft had placed in the jointly operated category. It was not rich in resources. It contained 3 of the early survey sites where human explorers had died in the first years of the expedition. Holt did not explain this in the room. He simply said the sector was important to his delegation and asked if it was a point of contention. Nobody contested it. The full treaty was initialed by every delegation before the end of the day. The formal signing was scheduled for the following morning. That night, Pell sat at a small table in the station's common area and wrote in his personal notes. He did this sometimes when he needed to make sense of something by writing it down. Wrote, I have been trying to identify when we lost the thread. I think it was before I was assigned here. I think it may have been before the outer belt was ever found. We looked at humanity and saw a useful species. We saw their ships and their data and their quiet presence in every corridor and station, and we categorized it. We never asked what they thought about any of it. We never asked what they wanted. We assumed that because they kept working, they were content. That is not the same thing at all. He paused. The difference between a partner and a tool is whether you ask. In the morning, they signed. Voss signed without making a speech. He held the pen in his hand for a moment before writing his name, and there was something in his expression that Pell could not fully read, not regret exactly, but something adjacent to it. The particular feeling of understanding something too late and having to carry that knowledge forward. Afterward, in the corridor outside the chamber, Voss approached Holt. They were alone for a moment. The aides and staff had moved ahead. Voss said something. Whatever it was not recorded. Holt listened. He nodded once. He shook Voss's hand. They walked in opposite directions. Over the next 3 weeks, human relay buoys came back online across the border zones. Not all of them. Some routes were now served by outer compact infrastructure that was newer and would stay in place regardless. But the dark sectors lit up one by one, and the navigation charts updated. And somewhere in the Selen corridor, the first human escort ship appeared on a patrol route that had been empty for almost a year. A Gorvek cargo captain logged it in her journey report. She wrote, "Saw a human patrol vessel at checkpoint 7. Did not need assistance. Good to see them." The Doroth system got its hazard warnings back. The Selen vaccine distribution restarted with a formal agreement this time, with compensation and recognition, and a signed document that named every party and what they were responsible for. The Atari built a small monument at their new compact station, a simple thing, just a plaque. It said that the station was founded in the 10th month of the year humanity stopped accepting less than it was worth. It said the Atari were grateful to have been present at that moment. Pell read about the monument in a trade report and added a note to his file. The note said, "Do not forget this, not the cost, not the cause, not what it took to fix it. Do not forget any of it." He closed the file and went back to work.